Okay, while we get set up here, can someone just verify that the mic is working okay? Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to apologize right off the bat. The video quality is going to be pretty bad when it's on this camera. So I have my potato webcam over here set up looking down at this makeshift reed desk, which means I have my wishes it was a potato webcam set up for my face. So, today we're going to go through, I guess I should say right from the beginning, some of you are going to be seasoned bassoon reed makers interested in my contrabassoon reed dimensions. Some of you are going to be bassoonists who haven't really started making reeds yet, and some of you are probably going to be non-bassoonists watching for some reason. So I'm going to try to keep this accessible to people that don't know much about reed making, but hopefully still useful for those of you who do know quite a bit about reed making. Okay, so a little bit about. So when you first try to get into reed making, if you just go to a store or go to a web store and try to buy cane, you're going to be confronted with a lot of options. So real quick, let's go over some of those options. So right here, we have tube cane. This is pretty much straight from the plant. It's been cut roughly to length and dried, but otherwise there hasn't really been any much processing. Unless you happen to live in a Mediterranean climate where you can grow cane, this is going to be the earliest stage that you can buy cane. It's going to give you the most control, but it's also going to require the most expensive equipment to process, and also the most time. And I guess you should also say it's also the least expensive way to buy cane. So if we go one step beyond that, we would use this tool here. This is called a splitter. It's just designed to do exactly what it says. Split this cane into segments. It's very uncommon to find cane segments for sale. Splitters are inexpensive enough that pretty much anyone who wants to anyone who wants to start from this stage is going to want to just buy a splitter and buy tube cane. So from here, we're going to use a tool called a gouger to take off material from the inside. Now, I don't have a contrabassoon gouger, but this is, well, okay. It's not heavy, or it is heavy, I should say. Okay. Yeah, so the cane goes down here. Then you take the material off the inside. Now this is bassoon cane, so I'm not going to do much with this because I don't have a bassoon or a contrabassoon gouger. But that is what a gouger is. They tend to be unexpectedly expensive. Okay, sorry, I'm going to need to get this webcam more secure. Okay. Okay, disaster averted. So from here, we're going to go in one of two directions. So some people would go straight to profiling, which is when you remove material from the... So with gouging, we removed material from the inside of the cane. For profiling, we're removing material from the outside of the cane. Others are going to go straight to shaping. Shaping is when we actually shape the cane into the rough bassoon shape, or bassoon or contrabassoon reed shape. I'll get into my opinions on this a little bit later. But this is a bassoon shaper. It's essentially a stencil for cane. You put the cane in, and then you cut it out to this shape. There is another kind of shaper. Shown in the top and middle on this picture here. This is a picture from Chris King's website. It's called a fold-over shaper, as opposed to this style here, which is the one I have, which is called a flat shaper. I have personally never used a fold-over shaper as long as I've been making reeds, so I don't have any, or I can't be of much help there. And then a profiler looks kind of like this. They come in different capabilities. This is a bassoon one, but I do have a contrabassoon profiler over here. And then eventually, we're going to get to this step here. This is called gouge-shaped profiled cane. This is a very popular type of cane to buy because it gets rid of most of the expensive equipment. You don't need a gouger, you don't need a shaper, you don't need a profiler, and you don't need a splitter. The downside is you have very little control over the reed, or these dimensions. And with bassoon cane, it's there tends to be a lot more options available. With contrabassoon, you're more limited. So I personally start from gouged cane. Looks just like this. And then I use my contrabassoon shaper and contrabassoon profiler to get to the gouge-shaped profiled cane that I need in order to eventually, or to start forming the reed. So, with the basic terminology out of the way, let's take a look at some dimensions here. So this is the dimension, or these are, I guess this is a good point to say that there are reed makers who have made hundreds realistically, tens of thousands of exhaustively recorded reeds, playing with every conceivable dimension to find the absolute best for them. I think, like a lot of contrabassoonists, I'm still in the experimenting stage where these dimensions that I have listed over here, these are the dimensions I'm having the most luck with at this moment. That's subject to change. These are pretty different than the reeds that I was using 2 years ago. So whenever I talk about exact dimensions, just keep that in mind. It's an ongoing process that I'm working on. Now, when you go to buy gouged cane, you're going to have two options presented to you: 150 millimeters or 142 millimeters. Here. And the difference is exactly what you would expect. One is 8 millimeters longer than the other. Otherwise, they're probably going to be the same. Now, the choice of which one you need is going to be dictated by your shaper. Shapers are designed for a particular length, either 142 or 150. Real quick, if I open up, so I'm going to open up this is the Fox Contrabassoon Shaper catalog. As far as I know, this is kind of hard to get a hold of these days, where they go over their various shapers, and you'll see listed here 150, 150, 142, 142, so on and so on. So I do have, so this is my old Contrabassoon profiler, Contrabassoon shaper, and it was designed for 142 millimeters. There's these pins in here that center the cane on 142 millimeters. The shaper I'm using now is designed for 150 millimeter cane. Well, apparently this cane's a little long. So that's the only difference between 142 and 150. However, what I would consider the number one rule of reed making applies. If you have any doubt, longer is better. Cane that's too long can be cut to size. Cane that's too short, you can't do anything with. And it also goes for thickness. Cane that's too thick, you can work with. Cane that's too thin, there's nothing you can do to make it thicker. Okay. So, if we look at my overall dimension, 70 millimeters, I mean, that's technically long enough. I could use a 142 millimeter cane here. But the shaper that I'm using at the moment, this is the SKB shaper, the Skinner Bronstein flat shaper from Fox, is designed for 70 millimeter or 150 millimeter cane. So if we imagine this box is the 70 millimeters, and which means it's going to represent the part of the reed that actually gets used as opposed to the part that gets cut off. This shaper is designed so that you're using almost all the way to the tip, and you're cutting off about 4 millimeters from the back. Other shapers are going to be might be designed so that you use the back and you cut quite a bit off the tip. In fact, that is the difference between if we go to the Fox, back to the Fox catalog, and we look at SKB and SKB2, that's the only difference. One of them is designed to use the cane all the way to the tip, and the other is designed to use the cane all the way to the back. One of them you're going to cut 4 millimeters off the back. The other you're going to cut 4-ish millimeters off the tip. Now, if I were buying a shaper over again, I would actually go with the SK2, because I've found that I'd much rather have some extra flexibility to make the tip wider, as opposed to extra flexibility to make the back longer. So if anyone has done the research and is looking to buy a shaper, my personal recommendation would be to consider the SKB2 over the SKB if those are the two options. Obviously, there's a lot of shapes I haven't tried, so I'm not suggesting this is the best. I picked out this shaper because Chip Owen sent me that catalog, and I knew from my old shaper things that I wanted to change, and I found the shaper that most closely fit that. These are not cheap, so getting 3 or 4 to try to switch between, well, I haven't been able to justify it, although it would be nice. Okay, now, so the other critical dimension on the gouged cane is going to be the thickness. Oh, I guess I should say here that if anyone's curious, Contrabassoon cane is usually about 30 millimeters. Sometimes it's smaller, like in the 27 to 30-ish, maybe a little bit bigger, but honestly, cane doesn't come that much bigger. Contrabassoon, and especially Contrabassoon, are not nearly as critical as far as the tube diameter as, for example, oboe. Oboists fret about, sub-millimeter differences in the tube diameter. On bassoon and contrabassoon cane, they usually, when you buy cane, they don't even bother to distinguish it. It's just, here's bassoon cane, it's a roughly 25 millimeters. Here's contrabassoon cane, it's larger than bassoon cane. So the thickness, usually when you buy contrabassoon cane, it's going to be about 1.5 millimeters thickness in the middle. Now this one that I'm measuring here, this one is a little over. This is about 1.55. But once again, it's making things thinner is easy. Making them thicker is hard. Now, you might be thinking, if you haven't done much reed making, you might be thinking, well, eventually I'm going to go in with the profiler and take cane off the top. So the gouge, why would the gouge thickness matter that much? So if we look here, we see kind of a rough illustration of a piece of tube cane. It's not consistent density throughout. We have this very thick, or this dense outer shell, and then the cane gradually gets lighter and more porous as we get to the interior. So what the gouge is going to do is determine what density this cane that we end up with is. If we imagine a thick gouge versus a thin gouge, the thick gouge, even if we eventually profile it down to be the same thickness, the thick gouge is going to have softer, less dense cane as opposed to the thin gouge. And over the years, we've found that about 1.5 millimeters works well for contrabassoon. On bassoon, you're usually aiming more towards like 1.35, 1.3. Crumhorn, I also use 1.5 millimeter cane. Now, there's another option that will be apparent on the cane, but at least on contrabassoon cane, they normally don't give you this option, and that is concentrically gouged or eccentrically gouged. Concentric means that it's the same thickness in the middle as it is on the edges, whereas eccentric means that they've used a larger blade in the gouger. As a result, it's thickest in the middle and thin on the edges. And this is for the same reasons that the gouge matters. The concentricity or the eccentricity of the gouge also matters. If we imagine, once again, our thickness, or our change in density from the outside of the cane to the inside, we'll see that the eccentric gouge is going to mean that we have more dense cane towards the outside versus the concentric gouge. And this is even more noticeable if we imagine that we've profiled it down. So as we're on bassoon and contrabassoon reeds, they get thinner towards the edges. Here, with the concentric cane, the edges are that soft, light cane, whereas with the eccentric gouge, it's more dense. Most contrabassoon cane I've found is eccentric, and on bassoon cane, I do find eccentric better. So I haven't had any particular reason to seek out concentrically gouged contrabassoon cane, but if you hear that terminology, that's what it's talking about: concentric versus eccentric. Okay, so I know you all are over here talking about shaping, or you're wanting me to actually make reeds. I know, trust me, I'm getting there. Now, there's another important thing that I want to mention here. If we look at the dimensions for this shaper, we're going to see that at its widest point, it's about 19.4 millimeters. If we look at the dimensions for this reed that I want to end up with, the widest point is 21 millimeters. So with that difference, or whenever you're trying to convert dimensions of a flat shaper to dimensions of a finished reed, you have to be aware of the difference between chord length and arc length. So real quick, if we imagine this circle here, and I ask you what's the distance between these 2 points, it would be perfectly reasonable to say this distance right here, the shortest distance, this is called the chord. A flat shaper, when you get dimensions for a flat shaper, you're getting the chord length, or the chord width. It would be just as equally valid to say, no, the distance between these 2 points is the distance along this arc, the arc of the circle. When I'm measuring a bassoon or a reed, that's what I'm measuring, the distance along the arc of this circle, because I'm taking that previously curved blade and it's almost entirely flat. So that's why dimensions between flat shapers and finished reeds are not, you can't treat them like apples to apples because of the difference between arc length and chord length. And there's some geometry in there you could dig into, but this isn't a math stream. Okay. So, let's get ready to shape my first piece of cane. So this is the 150 millimeter cane. Now, this is Glotin cane, Glotin. I'll be honest, I personally haven't, of the different cane brands I've tried, I haven't found enough consistent difference to recommend or to one particular type of cane over another. I usually buy Glotin cane because I can buy a Glotin cane by getting on my bike and having a nice, pleasant bike ride for half an hour, go to Nielsen Woodwinds, which is, just a few miles from here, and buy some Contrabassoon cane. Whereas any of the other brands, I have to order that online. So I have some Madeir here, some Rieger, some Gonzalez here. So that's really the only reason why I tend to use Glotin cane, is because I can get it locally and easily. For those of you who don't happen to live right near a double reed specialty store that has Contrabassoon cane in stock, I'm going to recommend trying out some cane. I'd probably start with the less expensive cane first. Just rule it out. Make sure it's not going to work before you... expensive isn't necessarily better when it comes to Contrabassoon cane. At least I haven't found a strong correlation between the quality of the cane and the cost. That being said, I did recently just buy some non-Glotin cane to try to see if I've changed my mind over the last few years. All right. So the inner surface, I don't know if it's apparent, but the inner surface of this shaper is curved. For whatever reason, the Fox shapers are curved in the opposite direction as all the other shapers I've used in my life. Curved down instead of curved up. So I'm going to unscrew that, kind of tension it with my fingers, and then screw it in. I want to make sure that it's evenly tensioned on both sides. It's easy to get, if I loosen it too much, it can get in a bind and it'll feel like it's getting tight, but it won't be. Now, okay, there is something I glossed over here. I said before that that you can shape and then profile, or you can profile and then shape. I'll be honest, I feel like the main reason most bassoonists, or most people profile and then shape, is because this is the only option when you're using a fold-over shaper. You need it to be thin in the middle before you fold it over to shape. When you have a flat shaper that you don't have to fold, I personally don't see much advantage to shaping, or to profiling first. So so this is bassoon cane for a second. Wow, it's not the right length. The issue that I have with shaping cane that's already been profiled is you have this segment in the middle, the most critical segment, the one that's going to become the blade of the reed, and it's much thinner than the rest of it. But there's no corresponding pocket on the inside of this shaper. So the shaper is going to be clamping down on the outside of the cane, but nothing's going to be securing this interior of the cane. So that's my 2 cents. I do think I would stress that I'm in the minority here. I think most bassoonists still get to this step before they get to this and then go to this step. So the process would look like this, whereas I do this. Okay, so back to shaping. Now, if we remember, this is eccentric cane, so there's going to be a thick spot, the thickest spot. Now, ideally, that thick spot is going to be equidistant between the edges, but not necessarily. So before I put this in here, I want to eyeball it and make certain that the thickest part of the gouge is in the middle of the shaper. Otherwise, I'm going to have side-to-side imbalance in the density of the cane. So it's nice and secure. Now, you're about to be working with knives. So you might think that what needs protection is, well, something that's going to come in contact with the knife. But what I've found is that the easiest way to get cuts on a shaper is from the cane underneath as you're holding it. So this is my absolutely ridiculous solution. There are, like those silicone finger gloves for like people that do a lot of filing so they don't get paper cuts. And I keep on meaning to buy one, but meanwhile, I've been using this paper towel wrapped in thread for about 15 years. There are better solutions, but I do think some sort of protection for underneath to prevent you from getting cut and to prevent splinters from the edge of this cane. Yes, Arte says that I need to patent this design. Okay, so this is just an X-Acto knife. Now, if you're going to be doing a lot of reed making, I'm going to suggest just go online and find a decent-sized package of X-Acto blades because you're going to be using them quite a bit. They are exorbitantly expensive if you buy like a pack of 5 in the local store, but if you buy like a pack of 100 on Amazon, or they're not that bad. So I'm going to start just a little behind this furthest point, or but this widest point. And go forward. Now, for the time being, I'm going to just go all the way to the edge. But if we go back here, we see that the thinnest point on most shapes is not the very edge. So if I were to just go all the way down to the bare metal in this direction, eventually what's going to happen is I get to this thinnest part and it rips the cane out. So I took off just enough so that I'm almost, so that I still have some cane in the back. And then I'm going to start coming in. Going towards the back of the cane, towards this smallest part, and then going towards the middle of the cane, towards that smallest part. I don't want to cross that smallest part with the knife, because that's going to rip out cane. So should end up something like this. Nice and flush and smooth with the exterior of the shaper. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Once again, at the beginning, I can go all the way through because I'm not anywhere close to the end. But as I get further down, I'm going to need to start coming back. And be very careful when you're coming back, because you're doing that thing that you were taught never to do when you started using knives. You're cutting towards you. Now, unfortunately, I guess if you wanted to be a good knife user, you could spin it around every time. I probably should have just done that and pretended like that's the way I always do it, but I do it this way. All right. Now the last thing I'm going to do is cut in this little notch. I found the best approach is, you really can't see this at all, to do 3 cuts. 1 right down the middle, then 1 and 2 for the exterior of the notch. I found that if I try to just do 2 cuts, it's likely to tear. All right, and the same thing for the other side. So as I'm doing this, if there's anyone watching who has questions about this step in the process, anything that I didn't talk about or wasn't clear enough on, now would be a good time. I'm just going to finish this one up. And cut out that notch. 1, 2, 3. Now, eventually what's going to happen is this blade is going to wear out and it's going to need to be replaced. And you're going to feel that as it... I find that eventually it's going to get harder to get a good finish. Now we have our shaped piece of contrabassoon cane. One thing I like to do that isn't strictly necessary, well, I don't have a piece nearby, is take a little bit of 600 grit sandpaper and just smooth out this transition period. Sometimes that area where you transition from going this way to going this way gets a little bit ragged. So, and anytime you have, like a little splinter like that, not only do you run the risk of stabbing yourself, that's also some place that it can tear and pull apart the piece of cane. So I like to just go in and clean that up just a little bit. So Xander asks, is there any differences at this point to bassoon reed making in your experience? Other than the fact that the cane's different and you need a different shaper, no. This is just this is how I do bassoon reeds. This is how I do contrabassoon reeds. And I think that that's pretty common because most people were not, most contrabassoonists were not taught contrabassoon reed making. We had a bassoon teacher, they taught us bassoon reed making, and then we just kind of had to figure it out when it comes to contrabassoon. Okay, so now I didn't talk much about it, but you'll see here I have my always useful thing of water. And this, when I shaped this cane, it was wet. I soaked it for about an hour to 2 hours beforehand. And that is what I would recommend. That's the safest way. Cane that's dry is fragile. It tends to crack. It's also more likely to splinter. It's harder to get a good finish. So unless you have a really darn good reason to shape dry, I would recommend shaping with the cane nice and soaked. However, there is one good reason to shape dry, but it's only going to apply. It's going to apply in only the most narrow circumstances. So, cane expands when it gets wet, when it's soaked, which means it's going to get slightly longer. The gouge is going to get thicker, and it's also going to expand in width. Now, what that means is that when you shape it, you're shaping it in its expanded state, and then eventually it'll dry and shrink slightly. The only reason I know of that it would be that it would even be worth considering to shape dry is if you want just a little tiny bit wider on the tip than your shaper is capable of doing. So here I have two pieces of cane, one of which I shaped dry, and the other one I shaped wet. This piece here is about 1/4 of a millimeter wider than this shape, just because I was shaping it in its shrunken state rather than its expanded shape. That's going to make a very small difference. So remember before I mentioned that I kind of wish I'd gotten the SKB2 shaper because it would give me a little more flexibility. I've found on my setup it would be nice if it were just a little wider than this shaper can produce. So that's why I have personally done some dry shaping. But that's the only reason I can think of that would be useful. Okay. So now we've gotten this, I'm going to move on to profiling. So actually, here, let's talk a little bit about profilers for a second. So this profiler here, this is my Contrabassoon profiler. Well, I say Contrabassoon profiler. This is the profiler I use for everything except bassoon. So I use it for Contrabassoon. I also alter it for crumhorn and other various things. This profiler is made by MD Reed Products. It's probably the most inexpensive profiler on the market. Now, the important thing to notice here is we have one barrel in the middle. This is what the cane's going to rest on. And then we have this follower bearing that's going to run on this ramp here. As I turn the barrel side to side to get to profile different parts of the cane, the ramp doesn't change at all. This is called a single barrel profiler. So a single barrel profiler allows you to do profiles that look like this. One-dimensional profiles, so we're going from thick to thin at the tip. Now we can control how thick it is at the tip, how thick it is in the back, and we can also, by altering this ramp, control the contour of that change in thickness, but it is a one-dimensional change in thickness. In contrast, this is the bassoon profiler I've been using my entire career. Thankfully, Dr. Rebe at the University of Arkansas still lets me borrow it. And you can see here that it has two barrels. The barrel that the cane rests on, and then a completely different barrel that this follower bearing runs on. And what that does is allows you to produce more complex two-dimensional profiles, so that it's not just getting thinner from the back to the tip, it's also getting thinner from the spine, which is this imaginary line that runs through the reed, to the edges. So, as you can imagine, the double barrel profiler is more expensive. It's generally better. It requires less finishing work. So I can take this design, or this here, and turn it into this by using files and knives on the outside of the cane, but that's more work. The double barrel profiler is able to get closer to finished dimensions before you even have to work, or before you even form the reed. But I don't have a double barrel profiler, and no one in this area has a double barrel profiler for contrabassoon. So that's why I use my trusty single barrel profiler. Now, this profiler that I have here does have one tweak to it. So if we look here, we have, these are the rods that the barrel rotates on. Now if we turn them over, we see that they've been flattened on both sides. And what that does is that means that it's going to sit lower when you get to that middle part of the cane. The short version is that it's going to add a slightly thicker part to the middle of this cane. So it's helping out a little bit in giving a spine, that side-to-side profile that we're talking about, that this double barrel profiler gives us. But it's not perfect. For one thing, it goes all the way to the edge. It tends to leave a thick part right at the tip, and I've found that can cause some cracking issues during reed forming. I've gone back and forth. You can deactivate this on this profiler. If I remove this screw and then remove another set screw underneath it, I can remove this pin and flip it around. That way it's perfectly round as it rotates. So that would get rid of this spine here. And like I said, I've done it both ways. I'm still not certain which one I like best. Alright, so let's get to profiling. Now, this one along the barrel, we have these indicator lines that's showing me. So there's a marking for 150 millimeters and a marking for 142 millimeters. There's also a marking for 120 millimeters, which is the length of bassoon cane. So for the 150 millimeter contrabassoon cane, I'm going to put that right on these lines. And I guess I should say that's what the lines are there for. Really though, what you should be aligning is this notch at the front of your shape. If you shape before you profile, like I do. Because that's the critical position right there. Because you're going to be cutting material off the back anyway, because I'm not going to make a reed that's 75 millimeters long. Now, the most difficult and finicky part to this is centering this side to side. Now, if you use a MD, or you can buy a set of shaper, profiler, and gouger that have these positioning that have a little positioning that add a positioning, I don't know, a notch, a blob, add a impression on the inside of the cane that allows you to position that centered side to side more easily. But since I don't have that, I have a mixed set. I have to just be careful at this point, getting it centered side to side. And then I want to make sure it's nice and snug. Sorry, I did that off camera, but nothing too exciting. And so that's going to hold it in place as I remove cane from the top. Now, as far as I know, so these dials here, control how thick it is at the tip and how thick it is in the back. But as far as I know, these numbers are not transferable from one profiler to the other. So telling you these numbers for me isn't going to help you that much. What you're going to need to do is profile a piece, set it large, or set it so that it profiles too thick, measure that, and then adjust those dials to be the way that you want it to be. I've made one other adjustment to this, and you can see how my ramp is not very pretty. It's because I did some custom grinding on it to make it a little bit steeper towards the tip. I found I was having an issue where it was, in order to get it thin enough in the tip so that it didn't crack when I folded it over, it was ending up too thin in this kind of middle part of the blade. So I did some custom grinding to bring down that angle just a little bit. Now, as I move this back and forth, it's going to be stopped by these thumb screws here, which you can adjust in and out. So adjusting that in, this is going to control the positioning of this this back collar. So if I just adjust that way in, then I'm going to have, it's only going to be like 32 millimeters from the tip to the back collar. What I want is about 73 millimeters between collars. And that's because I want a I want a 36 millimeter blade, but I need a little bit extra to cut off. So by making my collar to collar distance about 73, I'm going to have, well, probably a little over, closer to 74. I'm going to have about 1 millimeter to cut off from the tip. I could set the collar even further back, which is going to mean I need to remove more material from the tip. But once again, with this shaper, I want the tip to be as wide as possible on this particular shaper. So I want to build it so that, or I want to set it up so that the collars are as close together as they can be. Okay, so now I've started the collar on both sides, so I'm going to measure that. And I'm at 63. So can move it back. This is just to set up the collars because when I started I noticed the set screws were loose. Now we have 68. And that is right at 73. So I'm going to back it up just a little bit so I have a little more to take off the tip. So I'm not trying to cut off 0.5 millimeter from the tip. And then I'm going to make a note of this dimension here so I don't have to do that again. I can just set it up so that it's 0.463 inches here. And then I don't have to do that again. Okay, so now I can get to profiling. My recommendation is to take a little off and then flip it over. Don't try to completely finish one side. When another side hasn't been touched yet. You're liable to end up tearing chunks off. So I'm just going to take off a little at a time, flipping it around every now and then. This is probably wreaking havoc with the webcam. Normally I would be doing this on a more stable platform instead of one that flexes like this. And then eventually I'm going to get to the point where this bearing here is running directly on this ramp. And that means I'm close to done. Now, you can see here how I have a whole bunch of mess in the middle. What I'm actually going to do is back up this other screw just a little bit so that it's profiling a little further forward. I want it profiling slightly beyond the tip. That way all of that mess at the tip, or in the middle, goes away. The worst thing, or one of the worst things you can do is just grab a hold of this and yank, because that's probably going to tear out a big chunk of the reed. So, Nando, I have seen that video. I personally haven't done much with that other than, okay, yes. So you can see right there by adjusting it so it profiles a little further onto the tip, all of that stuff came off in the middle. I personally haven't messed much with that. Other than the Giga reeds, that is. I do think it's interesting when other people do. Okay. Now, one thing you want to be mindful of here is, unlike the gouger, the gouger has a curved blade. The profiler's blade is flat. So what that means is if I were to leave it in one place, never mind. If I were to leave it in one place, instead of the cane being curved, it's going to look like this, where there's just a chunk off the top. If I don't turn enough, it's going to look like this, where it's kind of faceted, where there's these thick spots throughout the cane. So as I'm profiling, I have to turn it just a little bit at a time to make sure I'm using so that this flat blade can cut as close to a curve as possible. Now, once again, what I like to do here is take a little bit of 600 grit sandpaper and clean that up, that transition period, and we end up with something that looks like this. Now, it's a little bit messy in the tip area, but that's going to be cut off. Actually, sorry, I guess there is one step that I missed here. Normally, before I profile, I like to use, I like to polish up the inside of the cane just a little bit to make sure that this interior surface is as smooth as possible. And I do that with this very high-tech sandpaper wrapped around a stick. This is just a inch and a quarter wooden dowel that I just bought at a hardware store. Hardwood's better than softwood, but you see that matches the interior radius quite well. Wrap my 600 grit sandpaper around that. And clean that up just a little bit. Now you can also, if you get some cane that's a little too thick, like 1.6 or 1.55 millimeters, you can also use some more aggressive sandpaper to take off a few, sub-millimeter increments. You don't want to have to go to town on that because that would take a while. As someone who has gouged sub-contrabassoon cane using this method, it's not fun. So yeah, I normally like to do that before I profile just to get this interior surface as smooth as possible. Okay, so I think what I'd like to do is I'm going to shape one more piece and profile one more piece. And if you have any questions, or any questions, anything I didn't go over or that I glossed over, now would be a good time. Or if you just have general questions. All right, so here's our shaper. So Xander says that Giga Racket reeds need to be taken more seriously. As the inventor of the Giga Racket, I disagree. It's well, I think the Giga Racket is taken just as seriously as it deserves to be taken. So this one was just a little bit too long. So I'm going to, once again, use my inanimate, mostly carbon rod and take off just a little bit of length. Once again, I'm not too worried about being super precise here because I'm going to be cutting material off the back anyway. I just need it to fit in the shaper. There we go. A little bit loose now, but once again, I'm going to be taking material off, so that'll be fine. Use my protective rag. And so once again, at the beginning, I'm going all the way through, but then by the time I start getting closer to the metal, I need to switch so that I'm coming back towards the center, or back towards the thinnest part of the shaper. Well, I mean, so Xander, that is kind of the point, right? If you wanted a musical, or I guess I should say, an instrument that just kind of made plop, 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 plop sounds every 6 seconds, then there are easier ways to go about it than the Giga Racket. But, having said that, if someone wrote a piece for the Tulsa Symphony and included a double and had the contrabassoonist double on Giga Racket, I would certainly play it. I would think it was funny and ridiculous, but I would do it. Yeah, yes, RA. It is essentially a woodwind metronome. Only it can only produce tempos in chromatic scale increments. So, you know, if you want to make sure all of your tempo relationships are related by the 12th root of 2, it's perfect. Otherwise, probably not so useful. Well, that's bound to happen. Sometimes you get lucky and you think you stabbed yourself and turns out you didn't. We'll see here in a few minutes. Otherwise, I might have to end early. I wouldn't want to get demonetized for blood and gore. Okay. I'm gonna feel around, make sure there aren't any rough spots or high spots. Xander, I'll be honest, I don't know what the London Underground sounds like, so I'll have to take your word for it. So, take that out of there. Clean up the transition areas. Usually I would use a reasonably sized small piece of sandpaper for this rather than an entire sheet, but that's what I have within reach, so that's what I'm using. Now, I'm gonna polish off the inside of the cane before profiling. And you don't want to, once again, the point here isn't removing material. It's not really making it thinner. It's making it more even. All right, rinse that off so I get that dust and grit that the sandpaper took off. So Arte says he likes the idea of a piece whose tempo or tempi are dictated by the key it's in, so that the rhythm would be a part of the harmony. I think it's one of those ideas that's interesting on paper, but I think most people wouldn't be able to hear the connection. So I think a lot of the musicians would find themselves wondering, wait, why am I supposed to play at quarter note equals 71.391? And then they would just say, 80 is good enough. So, taking off a little bit at a time, turning it around. So when I'm just taking off material, I don't have to be quite as careful about turning in such small increments. It can be a little bit faceted. But by the time I get to the end, on those finishing passes, I need to make certain, or I want it to be as smooth as possible. So, what would be the point of a piece entirely in 5/6 or 5/6 time? Like, I understand the value, the possible value of a piece that's in 5 or of a 5/6 time signature, if it's part of like a metric modulation, where, you know, the triplets in one beat or in one bar become the 8th note, so it would essentially the triplets would turn into a 5 pattern in the next bar. But I'm trying to think of what the value would be if it were in 5/6 throughout. That would just be 5/8, but designed to confuse people, I think. Okay. Arda is clarifying that was his example of a terrible idea. Okay. In that case, absolutely, 100% agree. Okay. And once again, it's a little bit messy in that overlap area when we're going to be clipping that off. Okay. So here, so what we've essentially done is we've created gouge-shaped profiled cane. Now, you can actually buy gouge-shaped profiled contrabassoon cane that looks pretty much like this, except you don't have control over the variables. So, like right now, I take my micrometer and very carefully measure it at the tip. Wow. This thing's going to be stubborn because it's unhappy that I dropped it. So right now, it's set up, it's about 1.2 millimeters in the very back, and what is it in the tip? About 0.5 in the tip. I've got to fix that. Those are larger than what they need to be. Like, I'm going to take that down, but because I don't have any side-to-side profile on this single barrel profiler, I need it to be thicker than I might otherwise want it so that I can add that in. If I try to take it down to be... If I try to take the thin parts down to as thin as I want them, then I'm not going to have any room. I'm not going to be able to create the thicker parts that I need. So, especially on a single barrel profiler, it's important to think about the thickest part of the profile that you need and base your dimensions off of that rather than the thin part. Okay, so in the next part, we're going to go over the basic forming part. So what's required to turn this into a blank? So we're going to fold it, we're going to score it, we're going to bevel, and yeah. So once again, I know this is going to be pretty similar to a lot of the bassoon reed making videos, but I did think you all, or some of you might like to see the contrabassoon dimensions that I'm aiming for here. So some of these dimensions didn't come into play this episode. Well, actually, most of them didn't. But so when we start placing these wires, these dimensions here will come in useful. And so unless there are any questions, I think that's going to be it. Oh. So any questions I missed? So Eric Lee did bring up something interesting. So when we were talking about the difference between chord length and arc length and how that relates to shapers, yes, Eric is correct. So the dimensions of a fold-over shaper are going to be more comparable to the dimensions of a finished reed, but not exactly, because a fold-over shaper still has some extra thickness at the tip that a bassoon reed or a contrabassoon reed isn't necessarily going to have. So you would still want to be a little bit careful in making apples-to-apples comparisons between those two different types of dimensions. Nando, I don't have. Nando asks if I have a bassoon reed diagram like this one handy on my computer. I don't right now. My thought would be, if you look around, I don't think that the bassoon reed dimensions I use are not that extraordinary. So, like, once again, with contrabassoon reeds, we're kind of continually reinventing the wheel. With bassoon reeds, I use the dimensions that my teacher taught me, and he uses the dimensions that his teacher taught him. So, in that sense, they're a little less interesting. I do. So, this bassoon shaper that I have here. This is a bell shaper. This is the dimensions are pretty close to the Hertzberg shape, which is the shape I used all through college. So when I needed to buy a shaper, I bought the closest thing I could get at a reasonable price. So that's why I got this bell model. I think they call it the Model H shaper, and I think it's supposed to be a pretty close match to the Hertzberg shape. I don't think it's marketed as a copy of the shape, but it is supposed to be pretty close. The biggest difference with the Hertzberg shape is there's a little more flare at the back. You can see how much this shape reflares at the back. That's for gives you more room for beveling. Okay, well, thank you all for coming today. So if you're around for tomorrow's stream, we're going to be talking about breaking the rules on contrabassoon parts. Does that make you a terrible person, or is that sometimes okay? And by breaking the rules, I mean playing things other than exactly what's in your part. And then Thursday, we're going to be doing another of those silly video game streams. So hope everyone stays safe and have a great day.